Happy New Year from a new history of Old Texas. I've been slow getting out the next season of this podcast, partly because I'm going to be trying something a little bit new in the new season, and it's taking longer to pull together. More to come there. We've also been busy continuing our field work on the search for the battlefield of Medina, and have made some really encouraging progress, which I hope to be able to report back on later in the new year as well. But in the meantime, I thought I'd take us back to Cabeza de Vaca for a minute, because it's a story that I feel like I'm always carrying with me. Just this last weekend, out at my wife's ranch in Coahuila, we stumbled upon an old burned midden, which is basically a prehistoric Native American cooking site. As I researched it more, I found that the ways that Indians were using these earthen ovens back in the days of Cabeza de Vaca and for thousands of years prior to that were frankly just like how I've had barbacoa de pozo prepared for me at ranches in other parts of Mexico today. It's the kind of through line in a mundane, everyday practice that just makes me feel good about life, and that can take us back even further than our written records could. And that's basically what I'm arguing in the speech that I gave at the Whitty Museum a few years back and that I'm going to share with you here. That we can actually see impressed upon Cabeza de Vaca's account direct evidence of native Texans' worldviews that are written out in the first person in the rock art that is everywhere in the lower Pecos region of Texas. Enjoy. Well, good morning, and thank you again for having me here. And I'm going to assume, if you're here at a Texas History Conference, that you have some passing familiarity with Cabeza de Vaca and his journey. So I'm going to be able to just hit the highlights, because I really want to get to a moment about 6 or 7 years into his journey that I think is a unique moment, a unique insight into the worldview of the Native Americans that he's living amongst. Because his account still is an account from a European's perspective. But what I'm actually going to argue is we can actually see some of the Native Americans' worldviews and mythologies kind of impressed upon his account. So, high level, Cabeza de Vaca, born in 1488 to a family of middling nobility back in Castile. He's born in Jerez de la Frontera. And so both the year that he's born and the place that he's born are kind of watershed critical moments. So obviously 1488 is just a few years before 1492, which is both the ultimate, the end of the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the Catholic monarchs of Castile over the Muslim Emirate of Granada. But it's also, of course, the opening of the New World. And Jerez de la Frontera, as its name suggests, in Spanish it means Jerez of the border. It sat for 200 years on the border of this conflict with the Muslim kingdoms, but then also too with the opening of the New World, all of this traffic, actually there was a royal monopoly that gets established in Seville, which is right next to Jerez de la Frontera. So all of the trade that's going on through the New World is actually coming through this area too. So all around Cabeza de Vaca for his youth are these stories of conquest and of exploration of the New World. His parents die when he's young, but he's still brought up in a pretty typical upbringing for a man of his class. He's attached to a powerful family in Seville, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and he fights in the King's Wars in Italy. He puts down some rebellions back in Castile, and by 1522 he's actually married pretty well for himself. But also by 1522, all of the wealth of the New World, all of the wealth of the Indies has started to flood back into Seville. So recall, 1519 is the Cortez lands in Mexico, 1521 Tenochtitlan falls, and it's just this torrent of wealth. All of a sudden, men of modest means but immodest ambitions are being, up-jumped in class. Cortez actually was pretty close in age to Cabeza de Vaca, and he was actually of a slightly lower rung of nobility, and he's on his way to being named a duke, raised up to the dignity of a duke. And so anyway, this captures the imaginations of all the young men and some young women too in Castile at this time. And so in 1526, Cabeza de Vaca gets his chance. In 1526, he is appointed the royal treasurer on the Pánfilo de Narváez expedition. Pánfilo Narváez was a rival of Cortez's, who goes back to Spain, or goes back to Castile. We should be careful here. Spain doesn't actually exist for several hundred more years, technically speaking. But goes back and he gets the commission for effectively North America. He gets the commission from the king to go settle the territory they call La Florida, the Florida, which actually at this time extends pretty much the entire northern rim of the Gulf of Mexico. So Cabeza de Vaca, and he's the royal treasurer, so he's kind of the king's personal appointee on what is otherwise kind of a private expedition. Narváez and other investors are what fund this. And very famously, of course, the Narváez expedition does not go very well. So they depart Spain, or they depart the Iberian Peninsula in 1527. At their first port of call in the Caribbean at Santo Domingo, 140 of the 600 men jump ship. They bail and kind of go find other jobs in the boomtown environment of the Caribbean. About 60 more of the men die from a hurricane that actually hits the fleet off the coast of Cuba, destroys 2 ships and 60 of the men. And then actually when they do try and sail from Cuba, they're trying to sail over to Panuco, which is basically modern-day Tampico. But they get tossed and turned in this storm and for 50 days and nights. And by the time they finally sight land on April 10th, 1528, they've actually sighted the western coast of Florida. They still think that it's the eastern coast of Mexico, however. They're terribly disoriented, and they really won't figure this out for years. I mean, it scrambles them entirely, and it almost makes this, it feels like the opening of some kind of, hokey, magical, realistic movie or something like that, that they're tossed and turned through the storm and spit out onto the shore. Well, again, it doesn't go much better for them on land either. So once they're on land in Florida, they spend, there's 300 men is all that's left to kind of disembark, and only about half of the horses they had brought along. They spend about 3 months chasing rumors of corn and gold throughout Florida, throughout the inland part of Florida. They lose another 60 men along the way, too, to disease and to hostile natives who aren't glad to see them there because their only previous encounters with Spaniards had been slaving expeditions. So by September of 1528, there's only about 240 of these men left. They make their way back to the shoreline, and they realize that they've lost contact with their ships. They have no way to reestablish contact with their supply chain effectively, too, because that was their real advantage, was their logistical and supply chain advantage, and that's cut off from them. But again, these are the go-ahead men of their age. They're si se puede kind of guys. They don't give up. They take all the iron they can, all the armor, the swords. They hammer them into nails. They fell trees. They fashion these rafts. So they spend 2 months basically rigging up these rafts. And raft is a generous use of the term because these crafts that they create ultimately, they're not watertight at all. The only reason they float is because of the buoyancy of the logs. So these rafts are like 45 feet long, maybe 15 feet wide. There's about 50 men to a raft. They make 5 rafts for the 240 or so survivors that are left, which basically, if you do the math, gives every person about as much room as a yoga mat. They get on there, these things they talk about, they're barely floating above the waterline. They're basically a hand length above the waterline as they're floating. And so November 1528, they trust their fates to the Gulf of Mexico, and they start floating along. Well, again, their luck follows them into the Gulf as well. So after about a week, they're out of fresh water, they're out of food, they're out of options. All along the shoreline, they can see smoke signals going up from as these native tribes are kind of warning their brethren that, hey, there's bad news coming, and so what that means is all the natives pull back from the coast. So there's no one even for these expeditionaries to trade with or to raid for that matter either. Well, I take that back. There is one tribe that actually comes out to greet them, that receives them and kind of brings them in very generously, and then it turns out to be a trap. They kind of turn on them and send them fleeing back into their rafts. And so, this goes on for about 5 weeks. And by the end of these 5 weeks, these guys are they're sacks of bones. I mean, that's literally, you could describe it. You could count the bones on their bodies. And it's almost, what hits them next is almost like a Greek Sisyphean torture or something like this. So 5 weeks, they have no fresh water. They're floating along the coast. And then suddenly someone realizes that the water in front of them, the water that they're floating through along the Gulf here, is fresh water. And they test it, and they can't believe it. And then they put down a sounding line and try and find bottom. And suddenly, whereas before they had kind of stayed the whole time in about 6 feet of water, just because it allowed them to, almost like a gondola, kind of keep pushing along and keep control of their shoddy crafts, they realize that they can't find bottom. They drop 180 feet of sounding line, and they can't find bottom. Well, they're coming across the mouth of the Mississippi River right here. So suddenly, they have more fresh water than they could ever use. And in fact, some of the guys drink so much that they're bloated and they can't even function. But it's also the current. The current of the Mississippi River, they realize, is so powerful. They spend 2 days and nights paddling against this current, trying to fight against it, but to no avail. So by the 3rd day, they wake up in the morning, and they're out of sight of land. They're out of sight of each other. These 5 rafts have been scattered to the winds, basically. So by the 4th night, they've essentially almost kind of given up on everything. They talk about, Cabeza de Vaca talks about on his raft, there was only 2 men that were left conscious by the time they went to sleep on the 4th night. Again, they haven't eaten in weeks. They haven't had fresh water. Well, they had fresh water, but they got too much of it, the day before. And so they're woken, however, on the morning after the 5th night of this, or the 5th day of this, by the sound of breakers in the distance, and then suddenly they're thrust onto the shoreline of modern-day Galveston Island. all they can do at this point is crawl. There's only a few men that can actually even walk at this point, and so they kind of crawl onto the shoreline. They make a half-hearted attempt to push their vessel, their raft, back out into the surf, but the waves just send it crashing back down, and actually in the process of this, they lose what's left of their clothes. They had taken their clothes off to try and keep them dry, but so then when the raft finally gets overturned, they lose all their clothes too. So now they're literally, naked, starving, all of their weapons are gone too, so all they can do is kind of sit and huddle on the shoreline. It's sometime, December or something like this in 1528. It's cold. And then, para el colmo de los males, just to put the icing on the cake, they look up on the dunes and 100 natives show up there. And they're huge. They recall them. They say they looked like giants. And again, there's some historical record of this too, that the natives of the Texas coast actually were quite tall. But they have, long bows that are as long as they are. And something changes here at this moment in the story, or maybe something changes in Cabeza de Vaca. And there's kind of even a debate amongst the men here on the shore. I mean, should they fight these guys? Should they try and run? Like, what should they try and do? Cabeza de Vaca, who is this great war hero from Italy, who's, raised on these great stories of romantic, combat, Amadis of Gaul and stuff like this, he takes a different approach. He realizes his nakedness. He realizes his vulnerability. And he just kind of leads with it. He goes up to the natives standing there. He walks up to them. The Cabocas is the tribe, as they call themselves, the Cabocas. He goes up to them and through hand signs tries to communicate what has kind of happened to them. I mean, it was evident that something bad had happened to them, but he still tries to kind of communicate this with hand signs, and it works. He's able to communicate. And he knows it works because they start crying. The natives actually start crying when they understand what he's telling them and what's going on, which is a remarkable reaction too, because, these guys still are kind of interlopers on an island of pretty limited resources, but elicits just this emotional response. And it kind of reinforces for Cabeza de Vaca a different strategy, the strategy that he's going to use, he and his other companions are going to use to survive the next 8 years of their stay in North America, because we're really only at the beginning here. This is 1528, and he's going to be there till 1536. And so, but I'm going to fly through some of these next years because, like I said, I really want to get to this moment further along in the story. And so, of the original 300 expeditionaries who landed in Florida, there's only going to be 4, really, that survive even the first few years. You've got Cabeza de Vaca, you've got Andrés Dorantes, and you've got Alonso Castillo, and you've got Esteban, who is described as, quote-unquote, a black Arab. He's a black man. We don't know quite his lineage, but there's various references to him being from somewhere from northern Africa. And he actually he came to the New World as Andrés Dorantes' slave, one of the other survivors. So these 4, basically, for the next 6 years, are going to survive essentially almost by handing themselves over to a form of slavery. They describe it as slavery. Slavery is a bit strong. They're working for room and board in a world of very limited resources. They're sharing the starvation of their keepers or of their masters. Unfortunately, they're kind of useless, even as slaves in the New World, at least initially. They don't know how to forage. They don't know how to hunt in this landscape. They don't know what to look for. And so they're reduced, and this is Cabeza de Vaca's language, they're pushed into doing, essentially women's work around the camp. They're having to scrape hides and to do those kind of things. And, and another version of women's work, too, and this is actually a highlight for Cabeza de Vaca of these years, he becomes a bit of a merchant. He becomes a trader, kind of going back and forth amongst some of the inland tribes and the coastal tribes, hawking various wares, red ochre and seashells and stuff like this. But again, too, in the cultures of those times, men didn't do that. Men were viewed as hostile. And there's a great book by Juliana Barr, that talks about this idea of that peace comes in the form of a woman. That in these early Texas tribes, women were often the bearers of peace and the bearers of trade and those kind of things, too. But again, it's a role that Cabeza de Vaca falls into. One of the things that Cabeza de Vaca observes very early on, and I think he may have observed this in particular as a trader, if he's trading some of these goods, was the unique role that medicine men, that shamans played in these cultures. So these medicine men, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions observed, they didn't have to work. They were allowed to take multiple wives instead of a single wife. When they died, they were burned instead of buried. And importantly, too, of course, being a medicine man, you don't just get to be a medicine man. You have to be able to cure people, to be able to heal people. And what they observe, too, is that when they perform a successful cure, they're paid quite handsomely by their patients. The going rate for a cure is the person basically gives the doctor or gives the medicine man everything they own, which feels like it invites a joke that's about what it costs today to get healed for most things too, for most doctors. But I think the idea is you've given that person back their life, and so everything you have is it becomes the property of the medicine man at that point. And so, and there's also something about Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes and Castillo and Esteban that seems to make some of the natives want to believe that they might be medicine men. And that's not too hard to imagine. They just looked so different. I mean, you've got 3 pale-skinned, bearded guys, 1 very dark-skinned, also bearded guy. They just looked, Native Americans hadn't seen anything like these guys before. And so very early on Galveston Island, there's actually a first instance of where the natives try to get the expeditionaries to be faith healers. So again, this part of the tragedy of this exchange here, when Cabeza de Vaca and his raft land on the island and the natives take them in and care for them and feed them, unfortunately there's an exchange of diseases. And actually it kills off, in this case, it actually kills off more of the old worlders than it does the new worlders. It kills off something like 80% of the expeditionaries and about 50% of the natives. And again, it's probably because the expeditionaries were in such a weakened state already. But this disease is running rampant through the camp. And the Cabocles, the locals, basically say to Cabeza de Vaca, all right, you guys brought this problem, you need to fix it. Here's some stones. We want you to rub these stones, pass these warm stones over the sick people. Here's some sharper knives. We want you to make some incisions, draw blood effectively from some of these other people, and say the right words and fix them. And at first, the expeditionaries think they're kidding. They start laughing. They start saying, like, yeah, that's not how healing works. And they say, like, you heal them or you die. Like it was a very simple proposition at that point. And so they take it seriously. And they perform this very beautiful syncretic ceremony of, they wait till sundown, till the sun is going down. They basically kind of perform like a mass. They repeat some Pater Nosters and some Ave Marias. They pass the warm stones over the victims. They incise them a little bit with the knives, and they finish with a big sign of the cross. And it worked. And it healed them. And the expeditionaries are as surprised by this as anyone. I mean, and they don't quite know what to do with it. They don't quite know what to make of this. They take this power very, very seriously. And it kind of scares them, frankly. They kind of tuck it away, and they won't pull it out again for several more years. But by the summer of 1834, they'd had enough. They'd made their way a little bit down the coast from Galveston. By this time, they're somewhere probably in South Texas, maybe around Brooks County, Hebronville, kind of something in that area. And again, it's still pretty hand to mouth. And so what they decide in the summer of 1534 is they're going to wait for the big prickly pear harvest, the big prickly, which is kind of the only time of real bounty in that region during the year, which, if you know anything about it, is also in the middle of summer, middle of August. I mean, just the hottest part of the year. But they were going to do that because they could take this bounty, they could dry some of the prickly pears, and at least they could move a little bit. They could have some mobile provisions that they could take with them. And so they decide September 1534, they're going to make their way south. They still have some notion in their head that if they go south far enough, they'll reconnect with New Spain, with Cortez's settlement down there. They're going to do that or they're going to die trying. And so they kind of sneak away from their keepers. They sneak away from the tribes that had been keeping them. And they come upon the first new tribe, a first new tribe where they're kind of unknowns. And historically, they had gone up to these tribes and essentially offered themselves over as beggars or as servants or as slaves or whatever. But they tried a different strategy in this case. And there's even a suggestion that it may have been Esteban who came up with this idea. They always sent Esteban ahead first because he was the most distinctive looking, but also because Esteban seemed to have a real aptitude for languages and for being able to find ways to communicate. So they send him ahead first, and he seems to tell this village, this community, that 4 great medicine men are coming. Not 4 beggars, 4 great medicine men are coming. So he's changed the expectation to begin with, and it kind of works. When they show up, they certainly look like nothing else this tribe has ever seen before. They show up, and the tribe is thrilled. I mean, it's like celebrities are in town. It's a rock band has showed up or something, or at least that's what they've been told. Now, again, of course, the challenge is you can't just say you're a medicine man. You have to actually be able to heal. And so they don't waste any time. The tribesmen pull up, 5 of their companions who are sick, and they bring them before these 4 new self-proclaimed medicine men. And again, same deal. They kind of fall back on this ritual that they had performed a few years before. They take some warm stones. They take the things that they've observed over the last 6 years, that they've seen the native shaman, the native medicine men doing. They copy that and they blend it, again at sunset, at that liminal hour. And they blend it with their own kind of liturgy and with their own mass. And they go through it. And it's many hours long. This isn't like an abracadabra kind of thing. I mean, this is something where they conduct a full ceremony. Because part of what seems to be going on too is that they believe that God has to be present to make these cures work. And they believe that God has to want them to heal, and they believe that they have to deserve, God's power to move through them. And in fact, at first, when they hesitate to cure, one of the reasons they say that their reluctance comes from is because they were afraid that their sins might interfere with their ability to cure. Like, they're taking this very, very seriously, and they feel like they need to do kind of this purification before they can do it. But once again, they do this incredible ceremony, and the five natives are healed. Again, it works. And again, the afflictions are unclear. It's always a little unclear what exactly the afflictions is, because again, the quantity of people that they're encountering that apparently are needing some kind of cure, I think scholars have written about all kinds of different theories. Is it just psychosomatic, or is it typhus? Like, do they have some kind of European disease, or is it just like psychological even? I don't know. It's a little unclear. We can't quite figure out what it is. But if nothing else, the performance of it seems to do something, and it seems to create this effect. And it's certainly Cabeza de Vaca and his companions' belief that this is what's allowing them to survive and to keep moving at this point too, because word starts to spread. Word starts to spread that these guys are here somewhere, and by now they're not quite to the Rio Grande. Maybe they're somewhere, Starr County, Texas, something like this. That there's these 4 incredible medicine men, and people start coming from all around. And what helps with this too is that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, there's another part to their strategy which is a little bit unique. When they get paid by their patients for their cures, they actually turn around and give it all back away to the people around them, which is remarkable for a couple points too. For one, in their first cure, one of the gifts they get is dried venison, and they don't even know what it is because they haven't seen protein in so long. At first, they don't know what it is. So these guys who have been starving and have been living in such scarcity for so long that they're able to then turn around and, I would become a hoarder. You know what I mean? If I hadn't eaten good in 6 years, I don't know that I would have that magnanimity of spirit to be able to turn around. But again, it creates almost like a bit of a pyramid. I don't want to say scheme, but it creates a strong incentive for people to keep supporting them and to keep coming to them, and soon they have a group of followers, and it grows. First it's in the dozens, and then it's in the hundreds, and then it's in the thousands. Literally at one point they say they have thousands of people following them. They're gathered around them, and there's some credibility to this. By the time they actually get back to New Spain, the Spanish accounts talk about how the Castilian accounts talk about how there's 600 natives behind them at that point. So there seems to be some credibility to this. So suddenly you have these 4 expeditionaries who for 6 years had been stuck in South Texas, unable to move at any appreciable speed, and suddenly they're the most sought after medicine men on the continent, and the speed of things starts to pick up. Like we talked about, building their entourage and starting to move. Now they're able to move much more quickly through the countryside. But all of this fame and all of this new kind of material wealth, it still can't protect Cabeza de Vaca from the more dangerous elements of the Texas landscape. And so one night or one evening when he's out foraging or out kind of on his own, he's separated from his band, and as the sun starts to go down, he can't find them, and he kind of panics. Obviously being alone is a terrible thing in South Texas, in the South Texas wilderness, and he doesn't know what to do. So he kind of, even as after night falls, he's still wandering around, still trying to find traces of these companions. And he also points out to us again here that he's at this moment. It's a strange that he recalls this for us just to set the scene. That he's still naked as the day I was born. Desnudo como nací. Naked as the day I was born. But then in the distance, he sees like a glow. He sees a faint glow. And so he starts going toward it. It kind of looks like a campfire or something. But he's very cautious. He doesn't know whose it is. He starts trying to listen for voices. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's no voices around it. There's no people around it. And he walks up to it, and it's a tree that's on fire. It's a hand of God burning bush in the middle of the South Texas Monte. And so he walks up to it. He by the way, doesn't emphasize for us the obvious biblical parallel. He just kind of keeps describing it matter-of-factly. He goes up to it. He's able to pull off some of the flaming, the burning branches and takes them with him. And that night he's able to dig a little hole for himself, and he makes 4 little fires around him, in the shape of a cross, one on all sides. He pulls some grass in over himself kind of as a blanket. And for the next 5 days and nights, this is his routine. He'll walk around, he'll keep these embers lit. At night, he'll dig his little hole, and he'll make his fires around himself again. But he still can't find his band, but he keeps doing this. And, this is what allows him to survive. But then on the 5th night, as he's sleeping, one of the fires throws a spark. It throws a spark, and it catches the grass that he puts on top of himself on fire. And he doesn't wake up until his hair is on fire, and he's partly burned, and he comes kind of leaping out of the hole, and he's having to pat himself to put this fire out, and he barely survives it. And it's memorable for him, and he says it'll leave him scarred even for years later. But he finds his band the next day. He finds his 3 companions, and he's reunited with them. as he tells the story of what happened, I think the parallel to Moses is obviously self-evident. I think his three companions would have gotten the burning bush parallel immediately. But what I think is even more interesting, and I want to dive deep on right here, is what his Native American listeners, I think, would have heard was him recounting the quintessential Native American underworld rebirth story, a story that the people of the Coahuiltecan Plains of northern Mexico and South Texas had actually been telling for thousands of years. How do I know this, or on what basis am I making this claim? At a couple points in my podcast, I've incorrectly lamented the fact that we don't really have primary accounts from the Native Americans, at least pre-contact primary accounts of their lives. But that's not strictly true, and there's really no better place to talk about this than here at the Witty, which is to talk about the rock art panels. Nestled in the canyons of the Lower Pecos River are hundreds of these rock art panels, which again, you can go right next door, upstairs actually, and kind of see these. And I'll talk, this is from White Shaman, which is one that's featured upstairs too, and I'll talk about this a little bit. But these things, they're in some cases 150 feet long, and 15 feet high. They're enormous compositions of real complexity. And at first glance, I think when you first see them, it's hard to know what to make of them, and it almost looks, like is it just scribblings, or the peyote hallucinations of Stone Age artists, or something like that. But there's a lot more to it, and the clues are in the compositional complexity. For one, when you go and actually analyze the pigments that they use, they're using items and resources that are scarce. The binder for their paint is deer fat, and we just talked about how rare deer fat and and protein and stuff like that was in these people's diets. These people are sacrificing resources from their diet to be able to create these paints. Also, an interesting fact I find is that the paints are almost always applied in the same order, the different colors. And I can't remember the order now, but they're all red, yellow, black, and white, and they're all applied in the same order in almost every composition. They've gone back and been able to analyze this, which means that if you know the order that those are applied and you're used to seeing them that way, and you're a contemporary, you can sit down and look at those and you can almost see them in 3D. You know that the red was on the scene first, and then the yellow shows up, and then the black, and then the white. So they're almost they're movies. They're effectively, Stone Age movies, relating events that are important enough to the people of this region that they're sacrificing their nutritional resources to be able to record them. So let's talk about a few of the themes that are some of the most consistent in these. And again, the reason this is relevant too is this is exactly the region that Cabeza de Vaca is going through about this time in his narrative. He's crossing the Rio Grande. He crosses the Rio Grande and kind of then tracks up through Nuevo Leon, up into Coahuila, and then somewhere around Coahuila too, crosses back over in the Big Bend region. And so right in the region of where most of this rock art is found. So one of the main themes that we see in this rock art is crenellated arches is the term. I'm using Carolyn Boyd's terminologies from some of her work on this stuff. The crenellated arch, which you can see right there, it's prominent in a bunch of these works, and it's interesting because it often almost looks like it's imposed on top of the work. If you don't know how to contextualize it, it looks like it's almost kind of thrown in there or dissecting the work or something like this. But the suggestion seems to be of this crenellated arch that it's suggestive of the layered nature of the worldview that these natives seem to have in their head. This idea of a subterranean, a superficial, and a spiritual world. And the arch seems to kind of represent that boundary, which, by the way, too, is also why these are frequently found in caves and in rock shelters. Those are also the kind of those archetypal liminal spaces, between the subterranean and the surface. Okay, another theme that you're going to see a lot is these skeletonized shamans. They're depicted often as almost without any meat on their bones, and the idea seems to be that they're figures that have learned how to see themselves through to their core. They're figures that have learned how to see themselves, through to their own nakedness, as it were. And you'll often see them here too, kind of bursting through these boundary layers, and they're able to cross between the layered worldview, between the subterranean and the superficial, between the spiritual and the material. And often too, by the way, they're often depicted holding kind of like the larger black figure there, depicted with like a flaming head, or like with torches in each hand, or flaming torches in each hand. All right, who does that sound like? So go back to the story I just told you about Cabeza de Vaca, sleeping in his hole and bursting out of that hole with his hair on fire, carrying his firebrands around the countryside. Oh, and I forgot to mention this too. So the number 5 is sacred in this region's tradition. There's actually even there's an Aztec word, or a Nahuatl word for their god of fire, Nayatecuitli. And the idea, Nayatecuitli refers to the group of four, where the fifth component is the group itself. Anyway, just the idea being that 5 is some sacred number. Well, remember, 5 nights was how many nights Cabeza de Vaca was out there. Look at his group. He is part of a group of 4. He and his companions are a group of 4 traveling as a unit, making that 5th group. If you're a Native American listener to this, and if this interpretation of some of this imagery is correct, when Cabeza de Vaca comes back from his misadventure out there in the monte, it's almost like he's walked out of the rock art panels, and into real life, is what I think it would have sounded like. And I can keep going too. So here's kind of a third theme that shows up through a lot through these. It's serpents, the theme of serpents. Serpents play a critical role here. And this is interesting too for me. In Cabeza de Vaca's account, right after he tells the story of being lost in the monte and returning to his tribe, he makes an interesting analogy. He talks about how they suffered greatly from kind of the heat and the sun and the work and the prickly thorns that they had to forage through in the South Texas brush country. And he refers to it. He says that they shed their skin twice a year like snakes, which is an interesting image. And then he also goes on to say, too, he talks about how the thorns, how painful they were, and the only thing that bore him through this was thinking of how Jesus' pain must have been so much greater with his crown of thorns and on the cross. It's an interesting juxtaposition because you've got the serpent, it's immediately recalling the story of the Garden of Eden and this image of original sin juxtaposed immediately not only with the image of Jesus as the redeemer of original sin, but also with Jesus at the moment of the redemption, on the cross with the crown of thorns and things like that. Well, let me take it here too to the Native American tradition, going back to the serpents and the significance of serpents here. So I'm going to quote some of these. This is from Carolyn Boyd's work here. So and these are all tribes. These are all Uto-Aztecan speaking tribes, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the Yaquis, these are relatives, distant relatives of the Aztecs. The Yaquis quote: "Entrance and exit to the supernatural world must be made through the mouth of a giant serpent." Here's the Hopis. "The serpent serves as the communicator between the earthly world and the world below. The Aztecs often depicted the surface of the earth itself as a serpent, and you could even picture this sometimes in your head, or if you've been to some of their temples, you can sometimes you'll have a large serpent forming like the base of the foundation and stuff like this. And the Huichols, who are still active today, the Huichols still today conceive of the world itself as surrounded by a sea-like serpent with 2 heads through which the sun must pass each day. In precisely the way the snake sheds its skin, it is constantly reborn. In the same way as the medicine man who passes from the spirit world to the material world is reborn. In the same way as the central figure of the expeditionary's faith is kind of what I argue here as well. So what Cabeza de Vaca is doing is he's using language and imagery from both the Christian and Native American traditions. He's kind of showing off his fluency in both of these traditions, but what it gives us is an insight into his gospel, essentially, or into his ministry, what he's saying and preaching to these Native Americans. But this kind of helps validate why it would have been working, when we kind of see similar imagery validated in some of their primary sources in this rock art. All right, so here's another cool detail, too. Cabeza de Vaca only gives us 2 words from Native American grammars, actually 2 Native American words, which is also interesting because they encountered all these tribes and they clearly found ways to communicate, but he only preserves 2 words for us. One of them is araka, which means come here, which I can't make anything of. But the second one is interesting. From around this time, he tells us that their word for dog is sho, X-O, sho. If you watch Mexican League soccer, like the Tijuana soccer team is the Xolos. The word in Nahuatl for dog is xolo, just like xolotl, which is their native dog deity and traditional guide to the underworld. And so, were Cabeza de Vaca's followers, native followers, walking around calling him Xo? Like is he their kind of native leader through the monte, through this kind of underworld journey that he's already kind of told us? We're getting a little out there, but for what it's worth, I have talked about this with Carolyn Boyd, and she thinks there's something to it. I don't think it's totally crazy. Kind of interestingly as well, Xolotl also famously is a famous twin in Aztec mythology, and his name even has the context of like a double or a twin, which is a nice transition into this incredible story from Cabeza de Vaca's account of what's very obviously seems to be a twin. And so this is an interesting story, too, because it takes up 3 or 4 pages of a 120-page narrative, and it totally disrupts the chronology that Cabeza de Vaca is telling. And again, it's the only real extended story from Native American mythology or worldview that he really gives us. So why? Why does he decide to preserve this story? And so let me just go ahead and read through it, and then we can count the ways that it sounds familiar. So from the natives' account, according to Cabeza de Vaca, it all started 15 or 16 years ago. They told us that a man had gone about in that land whom they called malacosa, bad thing in English. short-haired with a beard, though his face they could never clearly make out. Just before he arrived at someone's lodge, the occupant's hair would stand on end and they would tremble. And then suddenly Malacosa would appear in the doorway holding burning sticks. He would enter their lodge and take whatever he wanted from them. Then he would make 3 cuts into their sides with a very sharp rock. Then he would stick his hand into the incisions and remove their intestines, and he would cut off several inches. And the part that he cut off, he would throw in the fire. Then he would make 3 cuts into their arms. A short while later, he would reset the arm. They said that many times when they were dancing in their religious ceremonies, he would appear among them, sometimes dressed as a woman, sometimes as a man. And that when he wanted to, he could pick up an entire lodge and lift it in the air and bring it crashing down. They also said that many times they gave him food to eat, but that he never ate. And that when they asked where he came from and where he had his home, he pointed to a hole in the ground and said that his home was down below. So let me count all the ways that this is a doppelganger for Cabeza de Vaca here. I mean, even from what I've told you, hopefully it's already kind of obvious. But so first off, they said it started 15 or 16 years ago. So by now we're in 1535. 15 or 16 years ago takes us to 1519, the year that the Castilians landed in New Spain and actually landed also in Panuco, only a few hundred miles south of where we are at this point. Next, the reference to Malacosa as bearded. I mean, that sounds distinctly European. Next, carrying the burning sticks. Who did we just see walking around the countryside with burning sticks? Keep going here. It also sounds a lot like the healing ceremonies that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions have started doing, making the incisions with the rocks and resetting the bones. But there's like a cynical component to it here too, where it's almost like Malacosa is creating the injury and then fixing it. So you almost wonder, is this like a veiled critique that's coming through the Native American version of this? Do they view Cabeza de Vaca as like causing the problems that he's fixing? Malacosa shows up sometimes dressed like a man, sometimes like a woman. Who else have we seen doing traditional woman's work? Cabeza de Vaca. When Malacosa's hosts offer him food, they say, Malacosa often rejects it. Well, who else have we seen declining food? The 4 expeditionaries. They're declining food and giving it away to these other people. And lastly, when they ask where his home is, he points down below the ground. Well, Cabeza de Vaca is apparently walking around telling people that he digs a hole in the ground to sleep in and emerges out of it. I mean, if on the previous slide we kind of just suspected that Cabeza de Vaca was imitating, either consciously or not, some of the imagery and the iconography of this Native American worldview in this place, I mean, I argue in this, he is directly telling us how he has entered and kind of adopted this persona, this Native, how he has become a part of Native American mythology almost in what he's doing and the story that he's living as he wanders through Mexico. So I'm going to wrap up here, and to not leave you hanging on the story, obviously Cabeza de Vaca does make it back to New Spain. He ends up trekking entirely across the continent, though. He doesn't make it back on the Gulf Coast. He ends up crossing the Continental Divide. They end up over on the Pacific Coast, and somewhere around Culiacan, Sinaloa, is actually where he first reunites with Castilians. And if you want to hear more about this, if you want to hear the 12-hour version, please go check out my podcast. You can hear in more detail, because I'll even argue, too, that our instinct is to want to believe that the climax of the story is when he reunites with his old culture. But I argue it's not. I argue that actually there's a more important council that comes after that, where he really is playing, again, this kind of intermediate role between the European society that he's returned to and between the Native American society that he's become kind of an apostle for. That's the real climax of the story, is his role as an advocate and as an intermediary, kind of like a skeletonized shaman or something, that I think is the critical part of the story. And that kind of leads me into where I want to wrap up here too, is that there's one theme, there's one word that Cabeza de Vaca returns to over and over in this story, and it's the word naked. Nakedness, desnudo, acueros. It shows up dozens of times. I mean, like the only other substantive noun that shows up more is God. And he uses it kind of as a signpost. I mean, he's naked on the shore of Galveston Island when he arrives there. He's naked in the monte when he's in the brush in his little hole. He's as naked as Adam at a different time. He's as naked as a skeletonized shaman figure. And, it's a dual reminder for us of both his physical vulnerability, but also of this posture of extreme openness that he adopts in the course of his journeys, starting on Galveston Island. And that what he actually does, it's a survival strategy for him. He makes of himself kind of a blank slate, a tabula rasa. Once you kind of internalize that idea, you have the exhilarating kind of realization that we can actually then see kind of imprinted on that blank slate, on that tabula rasa, some of the worldview and some of the beliefs of the people around him, of the people that he's interacting with. Anyway, that's what I've tried to argue here. So hopefully some real scholars can come along and continue to dig on this even deeper, because I bet there's even more clues. But I wanted to share those with you guys today, and would love to answer any questions if you have any. So thank you.